Quest of the Three Worlds by Cordwainer Smith. When I attended the 49th annual Jack Williamson lectureship recently, I was very pleased to find this on a table of books offered for free to anyone who wanted them. I was informed by the special collections librarian that when they received copies of old books in better condition than the copies they already owned, they would give the worn ones away. Ever since I'd read glowing evaluations of Cordwainer Smith's work in Histories of the Genre by Harlan Ellison and by Thomas Dish, I had been eager to read his stories. I was doubly pleased by the fact that I got my first two Cordwainer Smith books for free. Though not perfect, both books were in pretty good condition. Cordwainer Smith is one of the pen names used by Paul Myron Anthony Linebarger. Linebarger had a distinguished career in the U.S. Army and wrote one of the first instructional manuals on the subject of psychological warfare. He was only 15 years old when his first story, War Number 81Q, was published in 1928. Aristotle is quoted as saying, "No great mind has ever existed without a touch of madness." In fact, there are many aphorisms claiming a link between brilliance and insanity. Linebarger may be an example of this assertion. I'll put links in the description to material dealing with the allegations that Linebarger may have actually been Kirk Allen, a patient treated by psychiatrist Robert Lindner, whose mental condition was the subject of articles and a book. I found this background material fascinating, and you may too. As I've often mentioned, SF publishers in the 1960s were fond of packaging the short stories of famous authors and passing them off as novels. These so-called fix-up novels were common. Many people found them disappointing, lacking the cohesive through line that experienced readers usually expect from a novel. Sadly, this book, at least for me, falls into the not that great category. Part of the problem is that my expectations were so high. When I realized this was a fix-up, I decided to hang in there and finish the book no matter what. And there are some really nice moments, some very imaginative situations, and some skillful wordcraft are to be found here. On the Gem Planet, On the Storm Planet, Three to a Green Star, and On the Sand Planet are the titles of the four stories used to create this literary fusion. All were originally published between 1963 and 1965. Linebarger, aka Smith, passed away in 1966, and I imagine this book was quickly thrown together to capitalize on any publicity surrounding his death. The portion of the book dealing with the Gem Planet was the least interesting to me. It takes place on a very wealthy world composed almost exclusively of valuable gemstones, making normal human existence impossible. The inhabitants are all wealthy, but they have to import all biological necessities. An eccentric man has brought a real live horse onto this inhospitable planet, and the beast becomes stranded on a sheer cliff of gemstones. Completely ignorant of how to help the exotic beast, the locals inject it with an overdose of a substance called stroon, which will ensure the suffering animal will live for thousands of years. That is not at all what the horse wants. I was most interested in the part of the book that happens on the Storm Planet. Here we find a wealthy old man who is infirm, but like the horse, will live for thousands of years. His deceased wife was a well-known sorceress with vast powers. Her intelligence has been placed into the mind of a subhuman servant created by combining turtle DNA with human genetic material. Does this all sound a bit trippy? Yes, it is. This was, after all, the mid-60s when an unprecedented number of folks were experimenting with LSD. All the worlds of this novel have so-called underpeople, derived from combining human DNA with that of horses, dogs, etc. This aspect of the tales seems to hark back to the Sumerian stories of the Anunnaki and their engineering of the human race by mixing their own genes with those of the apes they found on Earth. Anne McCaffrey published a story in 1969 called The Ship Who Sang. It was well received and is considered something of a classic nowadays. Smith's story, Three to a Green Star, contains a spaceship controlled by the mind of a human woman who wonders if she still exists as a full human or if only her consciousness was used like operational software in the ship's computers. This story may very well have been the inspiration for McCaffrey's more famous tale. Looking back, this book reminds me of some of the novels A.E. Van Vogt wrote. Van Vogt openly admitted that most of his stories were lifted directly from his dreams. Quest of the Three Worlds has a similar dreamy quality. Strange stuff is happening, some of it imaginative and compelling, but the usual structure and linear progression are missing. I mentioned earlier that I got 2 free Cordwainer Smith books at the event in New Mexico. The second book was a collection of Smith's short stories titled You Will Never Be the Same. I'll be reading that soon, and I imagine I'll have a much higher opinion of his unmanipulated short tales. The not especially interesting cover art for this Ace edition was created by Gray Morrow, a name well known to comic book fans. Quest of the Three Worlds by Cordwainer Smith, worth exploring, but probably not the best novel published under this author's name. If you're enjoying what you find here, please like, subscribe, and comment. It costs you nothing, and it makes a big difference in attracting other viewers.